Greetings. Randall Carlson here. I thought I'd talk for a few minutes about the celebration that we participate in every year about this time, late October, early November, and that, of course, is Halloween. Now, when I was a boy, back in the 50s and early 60s, Halloween was a pretty big deal. We would dress up in costumes and we would go around and trick or treat and sometimes actually play tricks on people. That was all part of the tradition. But it seemed like as I got into my young adult years in the 70s and even into the 80s, Halloween kind of waned in popularity. I recall a long time never seeing trick-or-treaters, there not being any particular Halloween parties. I guess people were engaged in other things at that time. Maybe it had something to do with the horror of the Vietnam War being over and people trying to get back to some semblance of normal day-to-day existence. I don't know what it was, but it seems like it started going through a revival in the late 80s into the 90s and actually became a celebration that was quite popular with adults and, of course, still is. And it has certainly revived. We see, at least in the neighborhoods near where I live, there's quite an ongoing tradition of people decorating their yards with various things that, to inspire fear and trepidation, skeletons and devils and witches and ghosts and cemetery-like things. It's just quite amazing what people are doing. So it seems like the Halloween has kind of come back around in popularity. There's a neighborhood near where I live that every year has hundreds and hundreds of kids come through, and everybody does everything up with all the decorations to get into the mood and the spirit of the thing. And I think it's great. But, the general idea about Halloween, it's not quite, recognized to have the same rank as some of the other hallowed celebrations and holidays that we participate in, such as Christmas or Easter or, even say it's 4th of July, which of course has a historical significance. It's great to see it back again, although some of the sort of the impressions, the general impressions of the holiday, or the celebration, I should say, by various factions have pretty much deprived it of all significance or any deeper levels of meaning. For example, I remember when 10 to 15 years ago when I was researching the origins of some of our various celebrations and where their roots, how far back their roots might go, I came across this little article by Eric Kenigsberg. It was published October 31st, 2010 in Parade magazine, entitled Lessons from the Great Pumpkin. And this is what he says. The true genius of the Great Pumpkin may be the way it sends up other holiday parables by having a character seek deeper meaning in the sole holiday that has no real lesson to teach. Is there any other day we celebrate that is as empty of moral or historical significance? Halloween exists today simply so that kids can dress up, run around after dark, eat too much candy, and scare the pants off one another. So, is that all there is to it? There's no moral or historical significance. There's no real lesson to teach. Well, if you have seen some of my earlier presentations on Halloween, you will know that I don't really agree with that. And I have presented a pretty succinct and conclusive argument that there is a much deeper meaning, to the celebration. An old 19th century commentary said this. This was, I think, recorded possibly on a documentary that was done on Halloween traditions maybe years ago. I don't remember even where I got it, but this is what it said. On Halloween, when the festival of the dead commenced, And this is quoted now, the spirits of the dead wander more than at any other time of the year. This is a night when devils, witches, and other mischief-making beings are all abroad on their baleful midnight errands. Going back to my Encyclopedia Britannica from 1963, which I actually still have, which I like to refer to sometimes, just to contrast the changes that have occurred in some of the various expositions on subject matter, because in 1963 there was a different climate, a different environment, and this was in the political correctness days. So it's kind of interesting and informative sometimes to do a little comparative look at some of the definitions and so on today compared to what they used to be a few generations ago. Anyways, Encyclopedia Britannica from 1963 said, in its strictly religious aspect, this occasion is known as the Vigil of Hallow Mass or All Saints' Day, November 1st. Now, Halloween was Hallow Mass Eve, the day before All Saints' Day, which was observed by the Roman Catholic and Anglican churches in Great Britain, Ireland, and the United States. Ancient Halloween folk customs persist alongside the ecclesiastical observance. The occasion shows clear connections with the religion of the Druids in pre-Christian Ireland and Scotland. So, right there, I mean, that completely refutes this idea that there is no historical significance to the tradition of Halloween. The Celtic year ended on October 31st, the eve of Samhain, and was celebrated with both religious and agrarian rites. For the Druids, Samhain was both the end of summer and a festival of the dead. The spirits of the dead were believed to visit their kinsmen in search of warmth and good cheer as winter approached. It was also an occasion when fairies, witches, and goblins terrified the populace. Bonfires were lighted on hilltops on the eve of Samhain. The tendency to manipulate rather than to celebrate folk festivals such as Halloween is characteristic of the 20th century. It reflects the growing influence of a rational outlook on life and the loss of interest in imagination and fantasy, which could go a long way towards explaining what I was referring to when I started this discussion about the waning interest. It seemed like for about one generation there was a waning interest. And I think right here we kind of see what might have been the cause behind that, just a general outlook. As it says here, the growing influence of a rational outlook on life and the loss of interest in imagination and fantasy. The secular character of contemporary culture is also reflected in public neglect of the religious significance of Halloween, as well as in progressive loss of its folk vitality. And here they make, the authors of this article in the Encyclopedia Britannica make a very interesting reference here. They say children are least affected by this disenchantment, and consequently the more important folk occasions tend to be dominated by the young. So I'm now going to jump back to some writings from earlier in the 20th century. I'm going to start with Robert Grant Halliburton, who actually wrote in the immediate years after the Civil War. And he did a very interesting paper called The Festival of the Dead, which appeared in New Materials for the History of Man in the year 1868. And Halliburton goes on to explain here the sequence of events that led him into these quite amazing discoveries about the origins of Halloween and some of its connections. He says, having had rather unexpectedly to visit England in 1859, I thought it advisable to prepare a brief paper for the Society of Antiquaries of London, and accordingly selected customs connected with All Souls' Day as a subject. On outlining it in England, it was apparent that the coincidences in the observance of this festival by different nations were much more striking than I had supposed. A new and most startling fact was discovered when I came to read over the paper I had prepared. It was singular that the Festival of the Dead amongst the ancient Peruvians was celebrated on the same day as by the Spaniards, that is, on All Souls' Day, November 2nd. I had also considered this merely as a curious coincidence, but it was apparent on reading over the results of my investigations that the festival was generally observed in November, south as well as north of the equator. A fact so remarkable that it was evident that, whatever could be the cause, it must be something hitherto unknown. From 1859 until the present year, all the leisure that could be spared from public and private engagements has been devoted to the inquiry. It was evident that the uniformity could not have been caused or preserved by any calendar now known to us, and that the festival must originally have been regulated by some visible sign or mark that nature had supplied to our ancestors and the Peruvians. In European calendars, the last day of October and the first and second day of November are designated as the festivals of All Halloween, All Saints, and All Souls. Though they have hitherto never attracted any special attention, and have not been supposed to have been connected with each other, they originally constituted but one commemoration of 3 days' duration, known amongst all nations as the Festival of the Dead, or the Feast of the Ancestors. It is now, or was formerly, observed at or near the beginning of November by the Peruvians, the Hindus, the Pacific Islanders, the people of the Tonga Islands, the Australians, the ancient Peruvians, the ancient Egyptians, and the northern nations of Europe, and continued for 3 days among the Japanese, the Hindus, the Australians, the ancient Romans, and the ancient Egyptians. The startling fact that this feast was celebrated among the ancient Peruvians at the same period, and on the same day that Christians solemnize the commemoration of the dead, at once drew my attention to the question: how was this uniformity in the time of observance preserved, not only in far distant quarters of the globe, but also through that vast lapse of time since the Indo-European first inherited this primeval festival from a common source? In the most ancient calendar of India, the year commenced in the month of November, which bears the name Cartigui, that is, the Pleiades, a constellation which must, by its rising or setting at that time, once have regulated the primitive year. We also find that in the month of October, the Hindus, like ourselves, have 3 days which are connected with the Festival of the Dead. In the ancient Egyptian calendar, the same resemblance can be traced between the name of the Pleiades, which among the Hebrews and Chaldeans is Athor-I, with that of the Egyptian month of November, which is Athor. The Arab name for the Pleiades, Ataria, also suggests a resemblance. And so I'm going to do a little share screen here. We'll look at the 3 names for the Pleiades. So we had the Athor-I, which is the Hebrews and the Chaldeans. Simply Athor was the Egyptians. And Ataria was the Arab name for the Pleiades. Now, if you look at particularly at this. Now, there are very interesting associations, particularly the goddess Hathor in the Egyptian pantheon, and Ataria, or in the Arabic language, its root is the same root as the word Taurus, which is the bull. And of course, the Pleiades marks the shoulder of the bull, the constellation Taurus, the bull. He then says, let us turn from the islands of the Pacific to Peru, and there we find the primitive calendar of 2 seasons marked by a New Year's festival of the dead occurring in November and celebrated at precisely the same time as in Europe and Polynesia. The month in which it occurs, says Rivero, is called Ayamark, from Aya, a corpse, and Marca, carrying in arms, because they celebrated the solemn festival of the dead with tears, lugubrious songs, and plaintive music. It is worthy of remark that the feast was celebrated among the ancient Peruvians at the same period and on the same day that Christians solemnize the commemoration of the dead, November 2nd. This is actually quite interesting. He kind of concludes by saying that, is it not somewhat startling to find that Australian savages at or near the time of Halloween, All Saints and All Souls, also consecrate 3 days to the memory of the dead as a vernal New Year's celebration regulated by the time-honored Pleiades, and like the Northern Festival of the Dead, beginning in the evening or with a Halloween? In the Tonga Islands, which belong to the Fiji group, the Festival of Inachi, a vernal first fruits celebration, and also a commemoration of the dead, which takes place towards the end of October and commences at sunset. And of course, south of the equator, late October, early November, is going to be spring. It was Virgil, the Roman poet, who said, the constellation of the white bull with the golden horns opens the year. So we could see that there was a year in the southern hemisphere that was marked by spring and the rising of the Pleiades. And in the northern hemisphere, there was also a year that began in the fall at that same time. And what we'll do here is we will take another share screen here so that you can see the compilation of the various of a partial list of ancient cultures observing Festival of the Dead in late October, November. We go through here the Judeo-Christian, Halloween, All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day, 3-day observance. The ancient Hebrew month of Markeswan corresponds to the time period that the sun is in Scorpio, the sign of death. The Celtic and Druidical, it was Samhain, associated with the legend of Avalon and the kingdom of the dead. And amongst the Anglo-Saxons, the Dutch, and the Swedes, November was called the Blood Month. In Egypt, the slaying of Osiris, Lord of the Dead, and sealing into a coffin occurred on the 17th day of the month of Athyr, which coincides approximately with late October, early November, approximately. Assyria, it was the month of Ara Samna, remembering the souls of the dead. Persia was the Mordid month, the Day of the Dead in early November, the month of the Angel of Death. In Peru, it was the Ayamarca festival, the carrying of the corpse, the placing of food on graves. In Polynesia, it was the Feast of the Ancestors, the honoring of the dead. The new year commenced in early November. Flowers and food placed on graves. In Mexico, the Day of the Dead was observed on November 17th. There is significance to that date as well, which we will come back to. In India, the festival of Durga, the new year commenced in early November with the Festival of the Dead. In the Mayans, you had Zantamoc, counterpart to Lucifer, and the story of his fall to earth as the Lord of the Dead in early November. In the Australian traditions, you had the Feast of the Dead and Ancestors, Aboriginal people painted themselves as skeletons and lit bonfires. In Japan, you had the Feast of the Lanthorns of 3 days' duration, bonfires, extensive rituals. So you can see that this idea was quite universal in extent, and which raises some very interesting questions that were asked by Robert Grant Halliburton. And in his studies, he came to some conclusions and made some very important connections. And one of those connections is this. A remarkable, and this is again quoting Halliburton, a remarkable fact, however, was incidentally forced upon my attention, that the memory of the deluge was by the Mexicans, the Egyptians, and the Jews associated with the same time of the year, and by the latter nations as well as in Greece. And with that day I had found some very peculiar superstitions connected in the Pacific Islands, as well as among most ancient nations. Among the Aztecs as well as the Egyptians, the deluge was commemorated at the beginning of the year of the Pleiades, when that constellation culminated at midnight. Now, what does that mean, culminated at midnight? Well, I hope that anybody hearing this will take it upon themselves to go out at midnight, late October, early November, stand facing south, and you will see right there close to your local meridian, you will see the Pleiades right there at midnight, which is a very interesting phenomena that it occurs in that manner here in our own time. Now, he also notes that there was some significance to the date of November 17th. And so he goes on. He says, we now turn to Mexico, and there we find that the great festival of the Mexican cycle was held on the 17th of November and was regulated by the Pleiades. It began at sunset, and at midnight, as that constellation approached the zenith, a human victim was offered up to avert the dread calamity which they believe impended over the human race. This belief was so remarkable that I cannot omit a reference to it here. They had a tradition that at that time the world had been previously destroyed, and they dreaded lest a similar catastrophe would, at the end of the cycle, annihilate the human race. Greswell, still quoting Halliburton, has devoted several chapters and much learning to the 17th day of November, or Athor, to show how remarkable a landmark it has always been through a long lapse of centuries. Even among the Persians, the same day was peculiarly venerated. In the ancient Persian calendar, the 17th day of November was held so sacred that all favors asked of rulers were granted on that day. Even tradition has been unable to preserve the history of this day that must be sought for in the earliest ages of the world. In the mysteries of Isis, the goddess of agriculture and of death, the funereal part of the ceremonies, the lamentations and search for Osiris, commenced on the 17th and ended on the 19th. Among the Greeks, besides existing in other ceremonies, the primeval festival of the dead appears under a veil of mythology in all the ancient mysteries, but above all, in the greatest of them, the Eleusinian. Now, I want to show you something. I'm going to do another screen share so that you will maybe begin to make the connections here. We have here a chart of some selected meteor streams with data. Now, there's two in this case that I particularly want to call your attention to because, meteor streams are predictable phenomena. The Earth crosses meteor streams every year, a variety of them, and there's usually dates upon which the peak of these meteors encountering Earth and its atmosphere occurs. If we look down here at the Taurids associated with Comet Encke, we see that the Earth actually crosses the stream twice, once in late June and otherwise in early November, peaks approximately November 1 through 3. So you have a meteor stream, the Taurids. Notice Taurus, the bull, right? The radiant, the point at which the meteors appear to be emanating from the sky, occurs very near Pleiades in the shoulder of the bull. Now I want you to also look here at the Leonids, associated with Temple Tuttle. Meteor shower peaks when? November 17th, the radiant in Leo. So we have some interesting connections here, which I am not going to go into on this little presentation that I'm doing here, because there'll be more information about this. In fact, there's a 25-minute presentation with a lot of graphics that I did 5 or 6 years ago, and it's available. There should be a link below to it, and you can watch more to learn about the connections between our celebration of Halloween and ancient events, particularly associated with global catastrophes. And this is kind of a lead into some new papers that have come out, bolstering the idea that the Taurid meteor stream has played a profound role in planetary history for the last maybe 20,000 years, and may also have been responsible for triggering a series of impacts that occurred on or around the beginning of the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe. So we will be doing another Randall Reports, where probably myself and Brad Young will be discussing the significance of this new paper. So until that time, I'm going to sign off for now, and I look forward to hanging out with all you guys again soon in the near future. And by the way, this is the Pleiades behind me. And once you have watched the multimedia presentation that I do on Halloween, you will appreciate the significance of this traditional childhood witch flying on her broom. All right. Until then.